This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this exploration of the hidden signals in our digital speech. We often imagine radicalization as a sudden descent into a rabbit hole. But groundbreaking research suggests a different story. A linguistic fingerprint visible long before a person ever joins a fringe community. Today, we'll uncover how subtle patterns in mainstream forums reveal a conspiratorial mindset, examine the emotional engines of anger and anxiety, and discuss the ethics of predicting human behavior through AI. Join us as we decode the language that reveals the likely path to the fringe. Chapter 1: Linguistic Fingerprints and the Myth of Sudden Radicalization. When we talk about how individuals find themselves embedded in the world of fringe narratives and alternative realities, we often reach for the metaphor of the rabbit hole. We imagine a person living a perfectly ordinary life who, through a series of unfortunate clicks or a predatory algorithm, is suddenly pulled into a dark, swirling vortex of misinformation. This narrative suggests that radicalization is an external force, a sudden and transformative event that reshapes a person's worldview almost overnight. However, recent large-scale scientific investigations into digital behavior are beginning to tell a very different and much more complex story. By analyzing the massive textual trails left behind by millions of users over the course of a decade, researchers have uncovered evidence that challenges the myth of sudden conversion. Instead of a sudden fall, what they see is a pre-existing linguistic fingerprint that is often visible years before a person ever makes their first post in a dedicated fringe community. This research indicates that the shift toward alternative narratives is not necessarily a change in who a person is, but rather the manifestation of a latent cognitive framework. This is often referred to as a conspiratorial mindset. It is a specific way of processing information and interpreting the world that exists independently of any specific theory about secret plots or hidden actors. To understand this, scientists looked at a staggering amount of data, encompassing over 500 million individual interactions spanning a 10-year period. They didn't just look at what people were saying inside extreme forums. They looked at what those same people were saying in mainstream, seemingly neutral spaces like forums dedicated to science, cooking, music, or gardening. What they found was that the individuals who would eventually become active members of fringe subcultures already communicated in a distinct way long before they officially joined those groups. The accuracy with which these future participants can be identified is one of the most striking findings of recent studies. Using machine learning models, researchers were able to distinguish future members of these fringe communities from the general population with an average accuracy of 87%. This was possible even when observing those individuals in social contexts that had absolutely nothing to do with alternative theories. Whether they were discussing a recipe, a new film, or a scientific discovery, their language carried subtle but detectable markers. These markers act as an early linguistic fingerprint, suggesting that the person already possesses a certain psychological predisposition. This finding suggests that platforms might not be creating these viewpoints from scratch through radicalization, but are instead providing a destination for individuals who already have a specific interpretive lens. One of the primary markers identified in this pre-existing fingerprint is a specific emotional tone. Long before they engage with alternative narratives, these individuals tend to use language that is characterized by higher levels of anger and anxiety. This isn't just a temporary reaction to a specific event, but a stable feature of their communication style across different topics and over long periods of time. They are more likely to use words that signal frustration, hostility, or a sense of being under threat. This emotional baseline seems to act as a fertile ground for alternative narratives, which often provide a concrete target for that pre-existing anger or a clear explanation for that underlying anxiety. When a story comes along that claims a secretive group is responsible for the things making a person feel anxious or angry, it fits perfectly into the cognitive slot that was already open. Another fascinating linguistic signal is the disproportionate use of third-person pronouns. This might seem like a minor grammatical detail, but in the world of social psychology and linguistics, it is a powerful indicator of how a person perceives social boundaries. A heavy reliance on words like they, them, and their often points to a worldview defined by a sharp distinction between an in-group and an antagonistic out-group. Even when discussing neutral topics, this linguistic pattern suggests a preoccupation with distant, potentially malevolent actors. It reflects a perspective where the world is seen as a series of actions taken by others, often at the expense of the speaker's own community. This us versus them framing is a cornerstone of many fringe narratives, and seeing it in a person's language years before they join such a community suggests that the social scaffolding for their future beliefs is already in place. This leads to a concept known as the monological belief system. In this view, a person doesn't just believe in one specific alternative theory. They possess a broader worldview where everything is potentially connected and nothing is as it seems. For a long time, it was assumed that people became monological through socialization within fringe groups, that they joined a community and then learned to see the world this way. However, the data suggests that for many, the monological perspective is the starting point, not the destination. The iceberg model of these communities posits that the most vocal and extreme members we see are just the visible tip. Beneath the surface is a much larger and more diverse group of individuals who share this underlying epistemological concern. They are brought together not by a single shared belief, but by a shared way of questioning and a shared suspicion of official narratives. The research also highlights how these individuals navigate the broader digital ecosystem. Scientists tracked the pathways people take through different communities and found that their participation is often a dynamic trajectory. Before they ever set foot in a fringe forum, many of these users are already showing signs of social marginalization in other spaces. They might experience friction in mainstream discussions, leading them to seek out environments where their specific linguistic style and interpretive lens are normalized rather than challenged. This suggests that the move to the fringe is often a form of self-selection. People are looking for a community that matches their pre-existing mindset, and the digital landscape makes it easier than ever to find that match. Crucially, the study of these linguistic fingerprints shows that these users are highly responsive to the social norms of the environments they inhabit, a phenomenon known as the Among Us effect, where individuals act as social chameleons who adapt to mainstream social norms. This filter also influences the types of topics they gravitate toward, even in neutral spaces, manifesting in a recurring thematic focus on power, death, social conflict, and religion. The longitudinal nature of these studies, tracking individuals over 10 years, allows us to see that these patterns are remarkably stable. While there is often a slight increase in the intensity of these linguistic markers just before a person joins a fringe community, the core signals are usually present much earlier. This suggests that the process of becoming part of a fringe subculture is less like a sudden infection and more like a slow, logical progression for someone who already sees the world in a certain way. The community provides the vocabulary and the specific stories, but the individual provides the underlying structure. This research also sheds light on the role of social interactions. It isn't just that these people use certain words, it's that they engage in specific types of social exchanges. Future participants in fringe communities often have more direct one-on-one interactions with people who are already members of those communities before they officially join themselves. These dyadic interactions act as a bridge, providing social reinforcement for their existing mindset, It creates a sense of belonging and validates their way of speaking and thinking. This social mediation is a critical part of the journey, but it works precisely because it resonates with the linguistic and psychological fingerprints that were already there. By moving away from the idea of sudden radicalization and toward the understanding of a pre-existing mindset, we gain a much clearer picture of the challenges facing digital discourse. If the signals are present years in advance, it means that the roots of these fringe cultures are deep and closely tied to fundamental psychological and social processes. The language people use is a window into those processes, revealing a worldview that is often fully formed before it ever finds its home in a specific fringe community. This perspective shifts the focus from the content of the theories themselves to the underlying cognitive and linguistic patterns that make those theories so appealing to certain individuals. Furthermore, the data suggests that these individuals are not a monolithic group. While they share certain linguistic markers, they also exhibit a great deal of heterogeneity. Some might be driven by a need for social uniqueness, others by a deep-seated distrust of authority, and still others by a desire to find order in a confusing world. The linguistic fingerprint is a composite of these different motivations. By analyzing the nuances of their speech, researchers can identify different subpopulations within the broader fringe culture, each with its own distinct set of interests and communicative habits. This diversity further complicates the idea of a single, simple path to the fringe. The discovery of these early linguistic signals also has significant implications for how we understand the impact of the digital environment. As we look closer at these patterns, we see that the language of the fringe is not a separate dialect, but a specific configuration of common linguistic elements. It is the frequency of certain words, the intensity of certain emotions, and the persistence of certain themes that create the detectable signature. This signature is visible because it stands out against the background of mainstream communication norms. The fact that it can be detected across so many different social contexts and over such a long period of time is a testament to the power of the underlying cognitive framework. This understanding of pre-existing fingerprints provides a foundation for exploring how these individuals behave once they are actually inside the communities they were seemingly destined for. It allows us to see the transition not as a break from the past, but as a continuation of a trajectory that was already visible in their mainstream interactions. The patterns of anger, the focus on outgroups, and the preoccupation with power that we see in neutral forums are the very same elements that define the discourse within fringe spaces. The difference is simply that in the fringe community, those patterns are no longer subtle signals to be detected. They are the explicit language of the group. Chapter 2: The Social Chameleon and the Mainstream Signal. When we imagine the digital footprint of someone deeply invested in alternative or fringe narratives, our minds often jump to the most extreme examples. We picture heated debates in dark corners of the internet filled with specialized jargon and overt accusations of global plots. But the reality uncovered by large-scale linguistic analysis is far more subtle. The most significant breakthroughs in identifying these individuals haven't come from watching them in their own territory, but from observing how they behave when they are among the rest of us. This is the challenge of detecting conspiratorial signatures in neutral, mainstream discussions. Finding the distinct signal of a specific worldview, even when the topic of conversation is as mundane as a new movie release, a favorite recipe, or a scientific discovery. To understand how this detection works, we have to look at the sheer scale of the data involved. Utilizing the longitudinal dataset of 500 million interactions over a decade and the 87% detection accuracy established in previous research, scientists focused on interactions in forums like r/Science, r/Humor, and r/Photography. To extract meaning from this ocean of text, scientists utilized Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count 2022, or LIWC 22. This specific methodology allows researchers to move beyond what people are saying and focus on how they are saying it. categorizing millions of words into psychological dimensions that reveal the underlying cognitive processes of the speaker. What this methodology reveals is that the individuals who participate in fringe subcultures are social chameleons. You might expect a single, universal conspiratorial language that looks the same everywhere, but the data shows something much more dynamic. A single aggregate model, one designed to catch a general conspiratorial style across the entire internet, actually performs quite poorly compared to models tailored to specific communities. In fact, community-specific models outperform global classifiers by up to 17 percentage points. This performance gap is the key to understanding the Among Us effect. It tells us that these individuals are highly responsive to the social norms of the environment they are in. They are not merely repeating scripts, they are adapting their communicative style to fit the specific expectations of the forum they are visiting. This adaptation is a form of linguistic camouflage. In a community like r/science, for example, a user with a conspiratorial mindset might adopt a more analytical or skeptical tone to match the factual, evidence-based environment. In r/humor, they might lean more heavily into irony or aggressive wit. The chameleon effect is so pronounced that if you use a model trained on a general population, you will likely miss them entirely. The signature only becomes visible when it is contrasted against the specific, well-defined norms of a focused mainstream community. When everyone in a science forum is using a particular linguistic standard, the subtle departure from that norm, the fringe signature, stands out to the LIWC22 analysis, even if the user is trying to blend in. To ensure these findings were truly capturing a unique signature and not just a general pattern of online behavior, researchers utilized negative and ideological controls. They looked at r/Ask/Reddit as a negative control, a massive, generalized community where millions of people from all walks of life interact on almost every imaginable topic. In this extremely broad space, the linguistic signatures of fringe users became almost indistinguishable from the general population. The noise of the community is too loud for the signal of the individual to be caught by global models. Conversely, researchers used r/men's rights as an ideological control. By comparing fringe users to those in a high-intensity ideological space, they could isolate the specific markers of the conspiratorial mindset from the general markers of political or social grievance. This confirmed that the signature is not just about being political or angry, but about a specific cognitive deviation from mainstream norms. The research further refines this Among Us narrative by identifying 3 distinct cohorts of users: joiners, converts, and veterans. Joiners are those new to the platform who gravitate toward fringe spaces almost immediately. Veterans are long-term users of fringe subcultures who have established a stable presence there. Perhaps most interesting are the converts, active Reddit users who participate in mainstream communities for years before eventually joining a forum like r/conspiracy. By tracking these converts, researchers can see the chameleon effect in action over long periods. Even years before their conversion, these individuals are already moving through r/science or r/photography with a detectable linguistic signature. They are already among us, participating in the same cultural conversations, but doing so through a different psychological filter that LIWC22 can identify long before the user makes their first post in a fringe community. A powerful illustration of how these two worlds collide is the visibility shock associated with major mainstream events. The 2026 study on the Jeffrey Epstein case provides a perfect example. When a mainstream news story suddenly aligns with themes common in fringe subcultures, it creates a massive influx of mainstream users into fringe spaces and vice versa. This event acted as a stress test for the social chameleon. During this visibility shock, the distinction between the veteran fringe user and the joiner from the mainstream became momentarily blurred. However, the underlying psycholinguistic signatures remained. The research found that the platform acts as a selection mechanism during these shocks. Individuals whose mainstream language already shared the signature of the fringe were the ones most likely to stay and integrate into the alternative community after the initial shock subsided. This ability to detect signatures in mainstream spaces suggests that the fringe and the mainstream are not two separate worlds, but are deeply intertwined through the people who move between them. The individuals we see in fringe communities are also active participants in our everyday discussions, bringing their unique linguistic profiles into the most ordinary of spaces. They are not a separate population, but a segment of the general public that processes information through a different psychological lens. By learning to detect the traces of that lens in mainstream discourse, we can better understand the reach and influence of these alternative worldviews. The detection of these signatures also reveals how these individuals respond to mainstream visibility. When a particular event suddenly becomes the focus of public attention, the language of the people involved changes in predictable ways. They might become more defensive or more focused on reinforcing their in-group identity. Yet they continue to use the linguistic tools of the mainstream community to frame their arguments. This dynamic response to external pressure is a key part of the signature. It shows that their language is not just a static set of traits, but a living, adaptive system that they use to navigate a world they perceive as increasingly deceptive. As we analyze these patterns, we see that the mainstream is actually the best place to study the conspiratorial mindset. In fringe communities, the language is so specialized and the topics so focused that it can be hard to separate the individual's mindset from the group's culture. But in a neutral forum like our science, the individual's unique psycholinguistic signature is forced to stand on its own against a different set of norms. This contrast makes the signal much clearer and allows researchers to isolate the specific features that define the conspiratorial way of seeing the world. The detection of these signatures is a testament to the fact that our language is an inseparable part of our psychology, carrying the markers of our deepest beliefs into every conversation we have, no matter how mundane. This linguistic evidence portrays these individuals as active participants who use a specific set of cognitive tools to make sense of the world. As we move deeper into the analysis of these patterns, we begin to see how this underlying framework influences the more specific and intense rhetorical strategies that these individuals employ as they move between the mainstream and the fringe. If the signature is detectable even in the most neutral of spaces, what does that tell us about the emotional frequency that powers it? Chapter 3: The Emotional Engine and the Mechanics of Loaded Speech. While the structural mapping of digital communities provides a blueprint of where fringe narratives reside, it is the emotional engine beneath the surface that drives their persistence. When researchers move from studying the location of discourse to the psychological state of the speaker, they enter the realm of computational psycholinguistics. By analyzing millions of data points, scientists have identified that the language of conspiracy-focused communities is not merely a collection of different facts, but a specific emotional frequency. This frequency is defined by a consistent baseline of high-intensive negative emotions, specifically anger and anxiety, that functions as a psychological prism through which all information is filtered. The prevalence of anger in this discourse is a primary differentiator. In large-scale studies comparing prominent conspiracy influencers with science advocates, the use of affective words, terms signaling hostility, frustration, and rage, is significantly higher among the former. Words like hate, kill, annoyed, and various expletives appear with a statistical regularity that far exceeds that of the general population. This anger serves a specific social purpose. It acts as a cohesive force, binding the in-group together against a perceived malevolent out-group. By expressing shared rage, individuals validate each other's feelings of marginalization. The language is designed to maintain a state of emotional arousal, making the narrative feel urgent and the stakes existential. The emotional profile shifts when moving from the influencers who create content to the followers who consume it. While influencers lean into anger to mobilize their audience, followers often exhibit a higher baseline of anxiety. This is visible in the frequent use of words like threat, horror, worried, and fearful. This suggests a dynamic where the rhetoric of the leader transforms the follower's underlying uncertainty into hypervigilance. The language used by these followers reveals a preoccupation with hidden dangers and a world that feels increasingly out of control. The intersection of the influencer's anger and the follower's anxiety creates a feedback loop that reinforces the conspiratorial worldview, making it highly resistant to outside correction. This contrast in focus is most visible when examining the vocabulary used by different communities. Computational analysis of word clouds reveals a striking divergence in priorities. In mainstream scientific discourse, the vocabulary is dominated by concepts like future, space, and world, terms that suggest a forward-looking, expansive view of human knowledge. In contrast, the vocabulary of conspiracy influencers is tightly clustered around specific figures and themes of conflict, focusing on terms like followers, Trump, InfoWars, Russia, and UFOs. This lexical density around specific political and fringe topics shows that the discourse is not just different in opinion, but fundamentally different in its objects of attention.
This emotional intensity is further amplified by the use of loaded language. This involves rhetorical strategies chosen to bypass rational analysis and appeal directly to the emotions. In conspiracy-focused communities, this often manifests through the repurposing of mundane symbols to carry heavy ideological weight. For example, seemingly innocent emojis are used as coded markers to signal in-group identity or to disparage out-groups, allowing the speaker to evade simple keyword filters while still communicating a clear, emotionally charged message to their audience. A key component of this loaded rhetoric is the use of dysphemisms. While euphemisms are used to soften an unpleasant reality, dysphemisms are words chosen specifically because they are blunter, ruder, or more emotionally jarring. In the context of conspiracy narratives, dysphemisms are used to exacerbate the emotional impact of a topic. Instead of saying someone died, a user might use a phrase like became worm food or dropped dead. This linguistic choice strips away the social niceties of mainstream discourse, creating a sense of brutal honesty that the community finds appealing. It signals that the speaker is part of the in-group, someone who isn't afraid to tell the harsh truth that the establishment is supposedly trying to hide.
Beyond individual word choices, the research identifies the recurring use of thought-terminating cliches. These are short, pithy phrases that act as psychological barriers to further discussion or critical analysis. In mainstream debates, when a person's worldview is challenged, they might use phrases like, "Anyway, it is what it is," or "We'll just have to agree to disagree." In conspiracy-focused communities, these serve a defensive function, allowing the speaker to terminate a line of reasoning that might threaten their internal narrative. By using a cliché that suggests the truth is out there, or that everything happens for a reason, they can effectively shield their beliefs from the friction of rational debate. These linguistic tools act as rhetorical armor, allowing the individual to navigate discussions without engaging with information that contradicts their mindset. This emotional and rhetorical style is deeply connected to three specific pillars that dominate the discourse: power, death, and religion. These are the narrative foundations of the conspiratorial worldview. The preoccupation with power dynamics, who is in control, who is being manipulated, and who is secretly pulling the strings, is a constant undercurrent. Similarly, the theme of death is used to raise the stakes, framing events in terms of survival or existential threat. Religious themes provide a moral framework for this conflict, casting the struggle between the in-group and the perceived elite as a battle between good and evil. These themes provide the structure that the anger and anxiety inhabit, creating a world where every event is a battle between powerful, malevolent forces and the informed few. The structural manifestation of this mindset can be seen in the way sentences are built, specifically through the use of agent-action-target AAT triplets. This is a narrative template where a specific actor is seen as performing a secretive or harmful action against a target. In conspiracy-focused communities, this structure is used to impose a sense of agency and intent on the world, turning chaotic events into deliberate plots. For instance, instead of describing a complex political event, the language might frame it as CIA provokes fake news that Russia hacked election, or FBI fabricates hoax of ISIS gold and silver coin story. Even when evidence is non-existent, the sentence structure itself creates a sense of deliberate malevolence, fulfilling a psychological need for order and explanation. This framing is supported by a specific type of causal language. Individuals in these communities are statistically more likely to use words that imply cause and effect, even when the connection between events is tenuous. This language is distinctly past-oriented and frequently references social status, focusing on historical precedents of failure or deception to explain the present. In contrast, mainstream discourse and corrections tend to be future-oriented and focus on pro-social relations. The conspiratorial habit of connecting dots across time and space creates a monological belief system. A counterintuitive finding in this field is the Epstein toxicity paradox. During the visibility shock surrounding the death of Jeffrey Epstein, researchers noted that while the volume of discourse increased, the toxicity of core users actually decreased. As the community shifted its focus to specific themes like violence and crime, the language became more focused on narrative building than on general hostility. This suggests that when a mainstream event validates a fringe theme, the community moves from a defensive, angry posture to a more active, investigative mode. The decrease in toxicity does not signal a move toward mainstream norms, but rather a shift in the community's internal priorities as they work to integrate new information into their existing framework. The impact of this language is not limited to the individual. It also shapes the dynamics of the entire community. In online spaces where these narratives are dominant, the language becomes a tool for social signaling. By adopting the specific emotional tone and vocabulary of the group, newcomers signal their readiness to be integrated. This process of linguistic adaptation is a form of social contagion. As individuals spend more time in these spaces, their language begins to mirror the norms of the group, becoming more hostile, more certain, and more focused on the core themes of power and deception. This alignment of language and emotion is what makes these communities so cohesive and so effective at maintaining their alternative reality.
The intensity of this language often increases during moments of social crisis. When a major event occurs that is shrouded in uncertainty, the language of these communities exhibits signs of emotional shock, characterized by increased complexity and a simultaneous expression of certainty and doubtfulness. They might use more certain language, words like truth, fact, and proven, while at the same time expressing deep suspicion of official reports. This paradox is a core feature of the conspiratorial style. They are certain that the official story is a lie, even if they aren't yet certain what the real story is. This combination of high-certainty rhetoric and high-anxiety themes creates a powerful persuasive force that can quickly draw in others who are also feeling fear or confusion. The study of these patterns also reveals a connection between language and real-world behavior. The high levels of anger and the framing of events as existential threats are the same linguistic signals that have been linked to vaccine hesitancy and the rejection of mainstream institutions. Language is not just a reflection of belief, it is a driver of behavior. By maintaining a state of emotional arousal and focusing on antagonistic outgroups, the rhetoric of these communities prepares individuals to take action. The words they use to describe their reality as a place of hidden plots and malevolent actors become the justification for their participation in fringe social movements. By analyzing the nuances of this loaded rhetoric, researchers can identify different subpopulations within these communities. Some might be more focused on themes of religious prophecy, others on political subversion, and still others on existential threats to health and safety. Each of these subgroups has its own distinct emotional profile and its own set of recurring narrative motifs. This diversity shows that the conspiratorial mindset is not a single monolithic state, but a flexible cognitive framework that can adapt to many different interests and motivations. However, they are all linked by the same fundamental linguistic patterns: the anger, the anxiety, and the use of language to impose order and agency on a world they perceive as fundamentally deceptive. As we look closer at the emotional engine of these narratives, we see that the language is doing more than just communicating information. It is creating an immersive emotional experience for the user. The constant use of loaded rhetoric and dysphemisms keeps the individual in a state of high alert, making the alternative narrative feel more real and more important than the mundane facts of mainstream reality. This emotional immersion is what makes these worldviews so sticky and so difficult to challenge. When every word is designed to evoke a visceral reaction, a rational correction feels like a cold and inadequate response to a world that feels like it's on fire.
This understanding of the psycholinguistic patterns of anger, anxiety, and loaded rhetoric provides a bridge to understanding how these individuals navigate the more complex challenges of digital life. It allows us to see how their persistent emotional and structural style informs the more specialized and adaptive strategies they use to maintain their communities in the face of external pressure. How then do these individuals, driven by such a persistent emotional state, adapt their language when the structures of the platforms themselves begin to push back?
Chapter 4: Coded Tongues: Evading Digital Moderation.
As the digital landscape becomes increasingly regulated, the communities that foster alternative and fringe narratives have had to evolve. This evolution is not just ideological, it is profoundly linguistic. To survive in an environment where automated content moderation and keyword filters are the primary gatekeepers, these groups have developed what researchers call cryptolects. A cryptolect is a complex in-group language designed to exclude or mislead outsiders while allowing insiders to communicate freely. This strategic use of language represents a sophisticated game of cat and mouse, where fringe subcultures use coded terms and semantic mutations to stay one step ahead of the algorithms designed to find them. By analyzing massive data sets from platforms like Reddit, X, and specialized forums, scientists are uncovering the intricate ways these linguistic shields are constructed and maintained. One of the most visible forms of this digital camouflage is the use of dog whistles. A dog whistle is a word or phrase that appears mundane to the general public, but carries a specific, often hateful or conspiratorial meaning for an informed in-group. For example, in certain extremist circles, seemingly innocent emojis are repurposed as racial or ideological markers. A taco emoji might be used to refer to Hispanic communities, while a ninja emoji is sometimes used as a slur against black individuals. Other symbols, like the DNA emoji, have been observed in conjunction with specific numbers to signal beliefs about racial superiority. To a standard keyword filter, these are just emojis, but to the community, they are powerful signals of identity and intent. This repurposing of common language allows fringe users to establish and reinforce in-group boundaries without triggering the automated social breaks of the platform. Numerical codes are another pillar of these cryptolects. Because numbers are often overlooked by simple text-based moderation, they provide a reliable way to communicate extreme ideas. The number 88, for instance, is a well-known shorthand for a specific neo-Nazi greeting, referencing the 8th letter of the alphabet. Researchers have identified even more obscure numerical references, such as 271, which alludes to a specific conspiracy theory regarding the death toll of the Holocaust. In one analyzed interaction, a user mentioned watching a video 88 times because 6 were not enough, a dual reference to both the greeting and the 6 million victims of the Holocaust, serving as a coded call for further violence. These codes are not static. As they become known to moderators, the community shifts to new variations, creating a constantly moving target for digital enforcement. This dynamic nature of the language is what researchers call semantic mutation. Just as a biological virus mutates to evade the immune system, fringe claims undergo explicit semantic and structural changes as they circulate online. Longitudinal studies of conspiracy claims on social media show that claims with higher levels of mutation tend to have significantly longer lifespans. By introducing variation and novelty, these mutations reduce information fatigue and renew audience attention. A claim might start as a complex narrative about a specific government agency and then simplify over time into a more digestible, catch-all phrase. Or it might undergo a process of assimilation, where it merges with other popular theories to reach a broader audience. These mutations are often tracked through the use of agent-action-target AAT triplets. If one specific agency becomes a flagged keyword, the community simply mutates the agent to a more generic or coded term, allowing the underlying narrative to persist. The development of these cryptolects is particularly evident in specialized subcultures, such as the incel community. This group has created a vernacular so dense and specialized that it almost escapes traditional linguistic description. Words like GYMcel, looksmax, or healthmax are used to describe specific behaviors and social statuses within the group. More concerning are terms like roping, which is used to refer to suicide, or going ER, a reference to a specific mass murderer who became an icon within that community. These neologisms serve a dual purpose. They create a deep sense of in-group belonging, and they act as a barrier to outside intervention. When a person uses this language, they are signaling their total integration into the community's worldview. Because these terms are so specialized and change so rapidly, general-purpose language models often fail to decode them correctly, frequently interpreting them as benign or unrelated to the community's actual intent.
This failure of technology is a critical part of the story. Researchers evaluated 8 different large language models across multiple tasks to see if they could detect or interpret these extremist cryptolects. The results showed that general-purpose models cannot consistently decode this language. For instance, a model might correctly identify that a post is about physical appearance, but completely miss the underlying reference to self-harm or violent intent. This is often because modern AI models are trained on cleaned datasets where toxic content has been removed to prevent the model from generating harm. While this makes the AI safer to use, it also limits its ability to understand the very language it is supposed to be moderating. Without domain-specific training and exposure to the specific vernacular of these fringe groups, the technology remains blind to the most dangerous signals.
The strategy of evasion also involves dropping explicit labels altogether. When major social media platforms increase their moderation of specific movements, users responded by removing the most common keywords and hashtags associated with their beliefs. Instead of using a specific movement's name, they shifted to broader, more socially acceptable issues that could act as a gateway. For example, some groups began focusing exclusively on themes of child safety or health freedom, using these as a front to draw in users who might not have otherwise engaged with more extreme content. On parenting apps, anti-vaccination activists learned to identify the specific keywords that would trigger the app's detection tools and then developed ways to circumvent them, such as using phonetic misspellings or substituting words with similar sounds. This intentional obfuscation makes it incredibly difficult for platforms to enforce their community standards without also catching innocent users in the net.
Linguistic camouflage also extends to the use of historical and cultural allusions. In many fringe communities, references to Nazi Germany or the Roman Empire are used to frame contemporary political events. Terms like Ziggel al-Hitler or misspellings of historical greetings are used to bypass filters while still being perfectly clear to the in-group.
The use of specific marching songs or historical slogans further reinforces the sense of a shared, secret history that the mainstream is supposedly trying to erase. These allusions are often multimodal, combining text with specific imagery or music that carries a heavy ideological weight. By layering these signals, users can create a rich, immersive environment that feels like a hidden reality, accessible only to those who have the key to the cryptolect. The research into these patterns also highlights the role of social connectivity in the spread of coded language. It isn't just that individuals use these words, it's that the community actively teaches them to new members. In comment sections, established users can be seen explaining the meaning of specific dog whistles or correcting newcomers on how to use a coded term correctly. This social reinforcement is what allows a cryptolect to remain stable enough to be useful for the group while still being dynamic enough to evade moderation. It creates a linguistic apprenticeship where joining the community means learning a new way of speaking that is fundamentally at odds with the mainstream. This linguistic evolution is not limited to text. It is increasingly multimodal. On platforms like TikTok, the combination of specific visual gestures, music, and coded captions creates a powerful and subtle form of communication. A controversial gesture or a specific song choice can act as a high-visibility signal to the in-group while remaining completely invisible to the platform's automated moderation systems. These multimodal dog whistles are particularly effective at reaching younger audiences, as they blend seamlessly into the broader culture of memes and trending challenges. The ease with which these signals can be created and shared means that the cryptolect is constantly expanding, incorporating new cultural references and digital trends to stay ahead of enforcement. The persistence of these narratives is also supported by the way they adapt to different platforms. A theory might emerge in a highly specialized fringe forum where the language is explicit and aggressive. As it moves toward more mainstream platforms, it undergoes a series of semantic mutations to make it more acceptable and less likely to be flagged. This process of mainstreaming involves stripping away the most overt extremist markers and replacing them with the dog whistles and coded language that can pass through moderation. By the time the narrative reaches a general interest forum, it has been transformed into a version that looks like legitimate skepticism or alternative opinion, even though its core remains rooted in the same fringe worldview. The study of these semantic mutations reveals that the language of the fringe is a living, breathing system. It is constantly responding to the pressures of the digital environment, evolving new ways to signal identity and intent. The use of coded language is not just a defensive strategy. It is a fundamental part of how these communities function. It creates a sense of exclusivity and power, reinforcing the idea that the members of the community are the only ones who truly understand what is happening in the world. This linguistic barrier makes it incredibly difficult for outsiders to engage with or challenge the community's beliefs, as they are literally speaking a different language. Furthermore, the research shows that these mutations are often systematic. There are predictable patterns in how a claim is simplified or how an actor is mutated to avoid detection. This suggests that the evolution of fringe language is not random, but is driven by the specific constraints and affordances of the platforms. By understanding these patterns, researchers can begin to develop more sophisticated tools for detection. But the dynamic nature of the cryptolect means that any technological solution will always be in a state of catch-up. The complexity of these cryptolects also poses a significant challenge for the design of responsible and transparent recommendation systems. If the most extreme content is hidden behind a layer of coded language and dog whistles, it becomes much harder for platforms to ensure that their algorithms are not inadvertently promoting harmful narratives. The semantic drift of these claims means that a post that appears benign today could be part of a larger, more dangerous narrative tomorrow as the community's cryptolect continues to evolve. This ongoing linguistic shift requires a constant and nuanced understanding of the social and cultural contexts in which these communities operate. As we look at the way these groups use language to protect and promote their worldviews, we see a level of linguistic sophistication that is often underestimated. The use of dog whistles, numerical codes, and semantic mutations is a clear indication that these communities are highly aware of the digital structures that surround them. They are not just passive users of the Internet, they are active architects of their own communicative environments. Their language is a tool for survival, a way to maintain their alternative reality in a world that is increasingly focused on finding and removing them. This strategic use of language is what allows fringe narratives to persist and even flourish, even as the social breaks of the digital age become more and more restrictive.
The intricate dance between moderation and evasion is a defining feature of the modern information ecosystem. It is a battle fought in the nuances of word choice, the placement of emojis, and the subtle shift of narrative frames. By decoding these extremist cryptolects, we gain a much deeper understanding of the resilience of fringe communities and the limitations of our current technological solutions. This constant evolution of language ensures that the signal of the fringe remains audible to those who know how to listen, even as it becomes increasingly obscured to the systems designed to silence it, raising significant questions about the ethics of prediction and the potential for supportive intervention.
Chapter 5: The Ethics of Prediction and the Supportive Turn. The realization that a person's linguistic style can predict their future involvement in fringe communities with high accuracy places the scientific community at a profound ethical crossroads. This discovery arrives at a time when the World Health Organization has officially characterized the proliferation of conspiracy theories and misinformation as an infodemic, signaling that the rapid spread of these narratives is a global challenge requiring more than just technical fixes. When the markers of a specific mindset are visible in mainstream discussions years before any formal engagement with alternative narratives occurs, the conversation must shift from simple content moderation to the implications of algorithmic surveillance. We are now forced to grapple with a system that can identify a psychological predisposition before it ever manifests as a specific belief or action. This predictive power brings into sharp focus the tension between maintaining a healthy digital town square and the risk of creating a system of preemptive exclusion that stigmatizes individuals based on their latent cognitive frameworks. The core of this dilemma lies in the shift from monitoring what people say to monitoring who they are likely to become. The temptation for platforms to intervene early is immense, especially given that research has established a concordance index of 0.70 for prioritizing at-risk users after as few as 10 posts. This metric suggests that a user's trajectory can be mapped with significant confidence almost immediately upon their entry into a digital space. However, using these models for individual surveillance or preemptive banning presents a significant human rights concern. A false positive in this context is not just a statistical error. It is a digital label that can lead to a user being shadow banned or marginalized in the very mainstream spaces they are currently using for neutral interaction. This risk is compounded by the inherent limitations of global detection models, particularly the performance gap between community-specific and platform-wide models established in earlier chapters. Without a deep, context-sensitive understanding of local social norms, algorithmic surveillance risks becoming a blunt instrument, particularly when encountering the cryptolects and dog whistles discussed previously. A global model that lacks this nuance may fail to identify genuine threats while simultaneously flagging harmless subcultural eccentricities, leading to the marginalization of specific groups based on linguistic style rather than actual harm. To mitigate the dangers of black box algorithmic decision-making, there is a growing advocacy for human-in-the-loop AI features. Rather than allowing an automated system to act as judge and jury, these features are designed to guide complex analysis while maintaining user and moderator oversight.
By providing interpretable variables, such as identifying specific psycholinguistic shifts toward antagonistic outgroups, these tools allow for a more transparent form of moderation. Transparency is the underpinning of trust. Without it, any attempt to manage fringe discourse risks being perceived as a secretive plot, inadvertently reinforcing the very suspicions the system aims to address. The ethical challenges of these interventions are further illustrated by the specific shifts in discourse during major visibility shocks, such as the Jeffrey Epstein event and its impact on user behavior. Ethically, this requires moderators to distinguish between organic curiosity and the activation of a pre-existing, potentially harmful mindset. This has led to a call for a fundamental change in moderation strategy, moving away from punitive actions toward what is known as progressive or supportive moderation. If the conspiratorial mindset is a latent trait, then banning an individual does not remove the trait. It simply displaces them to more extreme, less visible corners of the Internet. Instead, researchers suggest using early detection frameworks to trigger supportive interventions. This approach uses the predictive power of linguistic analysis not to silence users, but to provide them with targeted resources, such as media literacy programs or educational initiatives, designed to help them navigate a digital world filled with uncertainty. The ethical burden also extends to the management of large-scale datasets like the loco corpus. While these 88 million-word collections are essential for understanding linguistic patterns, the boundaries between mainstream skepticism and conspiratorial language remain soft. These categories are often dependent on the cultural knowledge and personal stance of those doing the labeling. This necessitates a sustained collaboration between linguists and ethicists to ensure that the categories used to describe these mindsets are robust and ethically grounded, preventing the accidental pathologizing of legitimate dissent. Furthermore, the persistence of the monological belief system raises questions about the nature of digital identity. If our long-term cognitive and emotional patterns are constantly being mapped, we risk a future of digital profiling that could have profound implications for privacy and social equity. The same tools that identify a conspiratorial mindset could be used to map other psychological traits, creating a record of our internal landscape that is more accessible to scrutiny than ever before. The danger of labeling is particularly acute when we consider that many individuals are motivated by genuine epistemological concerns. A healthy skepticism of authority is essential for a vibrant public discourse. When algorithmic surveillance conflates this skepticism with dangerous radicalization, it risks alienating a segment of the population that is necessary for critical debate. The challenge for future systems is to develop a level of interpretive reasoning that can distinguish between a mindset that is unconventional and one that has become a gateway to real-world violence, a task that current AI, which struggles with sarcasm and cultural subtext, is not yet fully capable of. Ultimately, the most effective long-term strategy may not be the refinement of surveillance, but the addressing of the conditions that make fringe narratives appealing. If the conspiratorial mindset is fueled by a lack of trust and a feeling of powerlessness, then the ethical path forward involves creating digital spaces that are more inclusive and transparent. By focusing on rebuilding trust in mainstream institutions and providing clear, factual information that does not discount the personal anxieties of the public, we can move toward an environment where the need for alternative narratives is reduced. The use of psycholinguistic analysis is a powerful development, but it must be used with a commitment to the dignity and agency of the individual. As we refine our ability to decode the language of the fringe, we must also refine our commitment to the values of an open public square. The words we use are a window into our deepest selves, and protecting the integrity of that window is as important as understanding what it reveals. This leads us to a final essential question. As our algorithms become better at predicting our paths, how do we ensure that the digital world remains a place where individuals have the freedom to change their minds?
The research into linguistic fingerprints transforms our understanding of the fringe, revealing that radicalization is often a slow manifestation of a pre-existing mindset rather than a sudden fall. By identifying subtle markers like emotional tone and coded language, we see that these individuals are already among us, navigating mainstream spaces with a unique psychological lens. This predictive power shifts the conversation from reactive moderation to the ethical challenges of algorithmic surveillance and the potential for supportive intervention. As we move forward, the goal must be to address the underlying anxieties and trust deficits that fuel these narratives, rather than simply silencing the voices they produce. Our language is a window into our deepest cognitive frameworks, and as algorithms get better at peering through it, we must ask, how do we protect the freedom to evolve in a world that predicts our every move? Thank you for listening.